My stepson sat in my late wife's leather chair, with his muddy designer boots resting on the mahogany desk I built with my own hands 40 years ago. He looked at me, smiled, and tossed a crumpled cardboard box onto the floor at my feet. "Get packing, Hank," he said, popping a piece of gum. "You are fired." He thought he was the king of the world. He thought he had just cut off the dead weight. He thought I was just a senile old man who had lost his protector. What he did not know was that while his mother left him the title, she left me the trigger. He did not know I owned 60% of the voting stock. Monday is going to be very, very interesting. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who has never worked a day in their life, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss how I take my company back. And before I tell you how I destroyed his ego, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. I stood in the doorway of the CEO office at Mitchell Logistics. The air still smelled faintly of lilies and rain from the funeral. But underneath that there was the sharp chemical sting of new paint. It had only been 72 hours since we lowered Catherine into the ground. 72 hours since I said goodbye to the woman who had been my partner, my soulmate, and the public face of this company for the last decade. I expected to find the office dark. I expected to come in, sit on the sofa where we used to drink coffee before the morning shift, and just mourn in the silence. Instead, I found noise. I found chaos. And I found Brandon. He was 40 years old, but in that moment, he looked like a petulant teenager playing dress-up in his father's suit. He had already removed Catherine's paintings from the walls. The beautiful landscapes of the Montana wilderness we had visited on our honeymoon were gone, replaced by modern abstract art that looked like spilled ink. He was on the phone when I walked in, barking orders at someone loud enough for the entire executive floor to hear. When he saw me, he did not stand up. He did not offer a condolence. He just pointed at the floor. That was when he threw the box. It slid across the carpet and hit the toe of my work boot. I looked at the box, then at him. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. My hands, calloused from decades of driving trucks and fixing engines before I ever put on a suit, curled into fists at my sides. I forced them to relax. Catherine would not want a scene. Not here. Not in the house we built together. Brandon hung up the phone and clasped his hands behind his head, leaning back until the leather groaned. "I thought you would be at the cemetery, Hank," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy that barely covered his mockery. "You know, talking to the dirt." "I came to check on the transition," I said, my voice rougher than usual. The grief had made my throat tight for days. "We have the quarterly logistics meeting on Thursday. I wanted to make sure you were ready to review the fuel surcharges." Brandon laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. "Fuel surcharges," he repeated, shaking his head. "That is exactly the problem with you, Hank. You are small picture. You are beans and bullets. I am big picture. I am vision. And my vision for Mitchell Logistics does not include a 72-year-old mascot wandering the halls telling war stories about the 80s. He stood up then, walking around the desk. He was tall, soft in the middle, wearing a suit that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. He stopped inches from me, invading my space, trying to intimidate a man who had stared down union strikes and bankruptcy and won every time. "I meant what I said, Hank," he sneered. "Pick up that box, put your little picture frames and your heart medication in it, and get out. You are fired. Effective immediately." I stared at him, trying to process the sheer audacity. "On what grounds?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "I am the senior advisor. My contract—" "Your contract was with Mom," he interrupted, stepping closer. "It was a charity case, Hank. Let us be honest. Mom felt bad for you. She knew you couldn't keep up with the modern world, so she gave you a fancy title and a corner office to make you feel important. She let you play businessman. But Mom is dead." The words hit me like a physical blow. He said it with zero emotion, just a cold fact to be leveraged. Mom is dead, he repeated, seeing the pain in my eyes and enjoying it. And now that she is gone, there is no one here to protect you. No one to force me to listen to your outdated advice. No one to stop me from cutting the fat. And you, Hank, you are the most expensive piece of fat we have. I looked around the room. I looked at the desk where Catherine and I had signed the papers to buy our first fleet. I looked at the window where we watched the city skyline grow over 30 years. I built this. I bought the first truck with a loan from my uncle. I drove 18 hours a day for 5 years. I was the one who taught Catherine how to read a manifest. We were partners. But because I hated the spotlight, because I hated the press and the galas, I let her take the CEO title 10 years ago. I let her be the queen because I loved her. And now her son thought I was nothing but a servant. You are making a mistake, Brandon, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You do not know how this company runs. You do not know the drivers. You do not know the contracts. If you push me out, you will lose the union support within a month. Brandon rolled his eyes and went back to his chair, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. I will hire a consultant to handle the unions, he said. Now are you going to leave, or do I need to have you removed? I would hate to embarrass you in front of the secretaries, Hank. It would be so undignified for a man of your age. I did not move. I stood planted like an oak tree. I needed to see how far he would go. I needed to see if there was any shred of respect left in him. He sighed, reached for the phone, and pressed a button. Security, he said. Send the team up. Yes, we have a trespasser in the CEO office. A trespasser. In my own building. 2 minutes later, the elevator dinged. I expected to see old Mike or Jerry, the security guards who had worked for me for 15 years. Men I knew. Men whose kids I had helped put through college. But the men who walked in were strangers. They were young, bulky, wearing tactical vests that looked ridiculous in a corporate office. Brandon had been busy. He had replaced the team. He had prepared for this. Escort Mr. Mitchell out of the building, Brandon said, not even looking up from his computer. And take his badge. He is no longer an employee. The guards approached me. One of them, a guy with a shaved head and a neck tattoo, put a hand on my arm. Let's go, sir, he said. Don't make this hard. I pulled my arm away. Do not touch me, I snapped. The command in my voice made him step back. I straightened my jacket. I picked up the empty cardboard box Brandon had thrown at me. I did not pack a thing. I left my stapler. I left my files. I left the photo of Catherine on my desk in the corner. I would not give him the satisfaction of watching me scramble to save my belongings. I walked to the elevator with my head high. The guards flanked me like I was a criminal. As we walked through the bullpen, the typing stopped. Dozens of employees, people I had hired, people I had mentored, looked up. I saw shock on their faces. I saw fear. They saw the founder of the company being marched out by hired muscle. I made eye contact with Susan, my executive assistant for 20 years. She started to stand up, tears in her eyes, but I shook my head slightly. I did not want her to lose her job too. Not today. We reached the elevator bank. The guard pressed the down button. I turned back one last time to look at the glass-walled office at the end of the hall. Brandon was standing in the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, watching me leave. He looked like a predator who had just killed the alpha and taken the pride. He smirked, a cruel, arrogant twisting of his lips that looked disturbingly like his father, a man Catherine had divorced 30 years ago because he was a con artist. The elevator doors began to slide shut. The last thing I saw was that smirk. He thought he had won. He thought he had just evicted a helpless old man. He had no idea he had just declared war on the majority shareholder. As the elevator descended, taking me down to the lobby and out into the street, I did not feel fear. I did not feel sadness. The grief for Catherine was still there, at a constant ache, but alongside it a new fire had been lit. I felt cold. I felt focused. I walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk. It had started to rain, a cold, gray drizzle that soaked into my jacket. I looked up at the towering glass structure of Mitchell Logistics. My name was on the building, but my access card was in the guard's pocket. I took a deep breath, tasting the exhaust and the rain. "Enjoy the chair, Brandon," I whispered to the wind. "Keep it warm for me, because I am coming back. And when I do, you won't just be fired. You will be destroyed." I turned my back on my legacy and began to walk. I had a phone call to make, but first I had to survive the night. I didn't know it yet, but the humiliation was just beginning. Brandon wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. The rain had turned from a gray drizzle into a steady, freezing downpour by the time the taxi dropped me off in front of the building where I had lived for the past 15 years. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the water soak into my shoulders, looking up at the penthouse windows. The lights were on. Warm golden light spilling out into the storm. For a second, just a split second, I forgot everything that had happened in the last 3 hours. I forgot about Brandon, the cardboard box, and the security guards. I just wanted to go upstairs, take off my wet boots, and hear Catherine ask me how my day was. Then the cold wind hit my face and reality came rushing back. Catherine was gone, and the lights were on because someone else was in my home. I walked into the lobby. The doorman, a new guy I didn't recognize, barely looked up from his phone as I passed. I didn't have the energy to correct him. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse floor. My hand was shaking. Not from the cold, but from a rage that was simmering deep in my gut, hot and dangerous. When I reached my door, I pulled out my key fob. It was a heavy brass piece that Catherine had custom ordered for us. I pressed it against the electronic sensor, expecting the familiar click of the lock disengaging. Beep. A harsh red light flashed on the panel. Access denied. I frowned and tried again. Beep, red light. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried the manual code, the numbers corresponding to our wedding anniversary. Beep, red light. They had reset the system. They had locked me out of my own sanctuary before I even had a chance to return. I pounded on the door. It was a solid mahogany door, thick and heavy. I pounded until my knuckles ached. "Open the door," I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. "I know you are in there." I heard footsteps on the other side. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Then the lock clicked and the door swung open. It wasn't Brandon. It was Tiffany. She stood there leaning against the doorframe, holding a glass of red wine. My wine. A vintage I had been saving for a special occasion that would never come. But it wasn't the wine that made my breath catch in my throat. It was what she was wearing. She was wrapped in an emerald green silk robe. The robe I had bought for Catherine in Paris 5 years ago. It was Catherine's favorite. She wore it on Sunday mornings while she read the paper. Seeing it on this woman, this shallow, grasping creature who had never shown Catherine an ounce of genuine respect, felt like a physical violation. "You are making a scene," Hank, Tiffany said, taking a sip of the wine. Her voice was bored, as if I were a delivery man who had brought the wrong order. I stared at her, unable to look away from the robe. "Take that off," I said, my voice low and trembling. "Take my wife's robe off right now." Tiffany looked down at herself and laughed. "It is just a piece of fabric, Hank. Besides, it fits me better than it ever fit her." Catherine was getting so frail at the end, wasn't she? I took a step forward, my hands clenching. "You have no right. This is my house. Let me in." Tiffany didn't move. She just swirled the wine in her glass. "Actually, it is not your house." Brandon checked the deeds. "The penthouse is listed as a corporate asset of Mitchell Logistics. It was a tax write-off, remember?" And since you are no longer an employee of the company as of this afternoon, you have no right to reside in corporate housing. You are trespassing." The cold calculation of it left me speechless. We had put the apartment in the company name years ago on the advice of our accountant. It was a technicality. It was never meant to be a weapon. "I live here," I managed to say. "My clothes are here. My life is here." Tiffany shrugged. "Not anymore. Brandon said we needed to clear out the old junk to make room for our things. We are redecorating. This place is too dusty, too old-fashioned." She raised her hand to brush a strand of hair from her face, and that was when I saw it. The light from the hallway chandelier caught a flash of deep cornflower blue. On her ring finger, sitting loosely where it didn't belong, was the sapphire ring. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. That ring wasn't just jewelry. It was the first thing I bought when the company finally turned a real profit in '85. I had saved for 2 years. It was a sapphire because Catherine's eyes were blue. I gave it to her on our 40th anniversary to replace the simple gold band I could afford when we were young. She never took it off, not when she was sick, not when she was in the hospital. I had only taken it off her finger 3 days ago at the funeral home because I was afraid it would be stolen. I had put it in the safe in the master bedroom. "Give me that ring," I said. The command tore out of my throat. Tiffany looked at her hand, admiring the stone. "Oh, it is beautiful, isn't it? A bit dated, but the stone is good quality. I might have it reset into a necklace." "It is not yours," I roared. "I gave that to Catherine. It belongs to me. Take it off." Tiffany's face hardened. She stopped pretending to be bored. Her eyes narrowed, revealing the cruelty underneath. "It is a family heirloom, Hank. And last time I checked, I am family. I am Brandon's wife. Catherine was his mother. It passes to us." "I am her husband," I yelled. "You were her step-husband," she spat back. "You were just the guy she married after her first mistake. You share no blood with her. You have no claim on the family jewels. Brandon said I could have it. He said it serves you right for being so difficult." She took a sip of wine, her eyes challenging me to do something about it. "Now if you are done shouting, your bags are downstairs. We had the movers pack up your clothes and whatever personal trash we found. It is on the curb. You might want to hurry. It is raining pretty hard out there." She stepped back and slammed the heavy door in my face. The sound was like a gunshot. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wood grain, hearing the lock click back into place. I could hear her laughing on the other side. I raised my hand to pound on the door again, to break it down if I had to, but my arm fell to my side. I was 72 years old. I was alone, and they had the law, the locks, and the security on their side. If I broke that door down, I would end up in a jail cell and they would win. I turned around and walked back to the elevator. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through deep mud. When I got down to the street, I saw them. 3 suitcases, my old leather travel bags sitting on the wet pavement near the gutter. They were soaked. One of them had tipped over, and some of my shirts had spilled out into a puddle of oily water. I walked over and knelt down in the rain. I picked up a shirt. It was the blue flannel one Catherine liked me to wear on weekends. It was ruined, stained with street grime. I looked around. Passers-by were hurrying past under umbrellas, not looking at the old man kneeling in the gutter. The doorman watched me from inside the warm, dry lobby, his face blank. I gathered the wet clothes and shoved them back into the bag. My hands were numb. The rain ran down my face, mixing with the hot tears I refused to let fall. I had built a trucking empire. I had employed hundreds of people. I had been a husband, a father figure, a provider. And in the span of 6 hours, I had been stripped of everything. My job, my home, my wife's memory, even the ring that symbolized our eternal bond. I stood up, gripping the handles of my wet suitcases. The water dripped from the brim of my hat. I looked up at the penthouse one last time. I could see Tiffany's silhouette in the window looking down. They thought this was the end. They thought they had thrown the trash out. I hailed a taxi, my movements stiff and mechanical. As I loaded my soaked life into the trunk, I touched the empty spot in my pocket where my house key used to be. "You want to play dirty?" "Brandon," I whispered, my voice lost in the sound of the rain. "You want to take everything, fine. But you forgot one thing. You can steal the house. You can steal the ring. But you cannot steal the man who built it all." I got into the taxi. The driver asked me where to. "Motel 6, I said. "The one by the highway." It was the only place I could afford with the cash in my pocket. I watched the city pass by through the rain-streaked window. I was homeless. I was humiliated. But as I clenched my jaw, I felt a spark in the darkness. They had taken my comfort. But they had given me something else. They had given me a reason to fight. And I had never lost a fight in my life. The neon sign of the Motel 6 flickered with a dying buzz, casting a sickly yellow light onto the wet pavement of the parking lot. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and stale cigarette smoke, a sharp contrast to the lavender and cedar scent that used to fill the hallways of my penthouse. I walked into the lobby, my wet boots squeaking on the linoleum floor. The clerk, a teenager with headphones around his neck, didn't even look up from his phone until I cleared my throat. I paid for a single room with cash, counting out the bills, with hands that were starting to feel numb, not just from the cold, but from something else, something tightening in my chest. Room 104 was on the ground floor facing the highway. When I opened the door, the smell hit me. It was a mixture of industrial cleaner and decades of chain smoking that had seeped into the drywall. The carpet was a shade of brown that seemed designed to hide stains. I dropped my soaked suitcases onto the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned in protest, digging into my spine. That was when the pain hit me. It wasn't the dull ache of grief I had been living with for 3 days. This was sharp. It felt like an iron fist had reached inside my ribcage and was squeezing my heart. My breath hitched. I gasped, clutching my chest, my vision swimming with black spots. My nitroglycerin. I had left it in the desk drawer at the office. I had left it in the cardboard box that Brandon had thrown at me, the box I had abandoned in my pride. I needed medication. Now. I forced myself to stand up. The world tilted dangerously, but I grabbed the doorframe to steady myself. There was a 24-hour pharmacy 3 blocks down the road. I knew the neighborhood. I knew where to go. I just had to make it there. I walked back out into the rain. The cold water felt like needles on my skin, but it helped keep me conscious. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Left. Right. Breathe. Left. Right. Breathe. The pharmacy was bright, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. I walked to the counter, my face pale sweat mixing with the rainwater on my forehead. The pharmacist, a kind-looking woman with glasses, took one look at me and asked if I needed an ambulance. "I just need my prescription," I wheezed. "The name is Hank Mitchell. It should be in the system." She typed on her computer, frowning. "I see it here, Mr. Mitchell, but it looks like your insurance has been flagged. It is showing as inactive." Brandon. He hadn't just fired me. He had canceled my coverage before the ink was even dry on the termination paperwork. "It doesn't matter," I said, my voice tight with pain. "I will pay out of pocket. Just give me the pills." She nodded and went to the shelf. She came back with the small brown bottle. "That will be $140, sir." I reached for my wallet. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I pulled out my Platinum American Express, the card I had used to buy fleet trucks, the card I had used to take Catherine to Italy. I swiped it in the terminal. Waiting. Waiting. Declined. I stared at the red letters on the screen. "There must be a mistake," I muttered. "Try it again." She swiped it again. Declined. Please contact your financial institution. I pulled out my Visa. This was my personal card. Or so I thought. I swiped it. Declined. I pulled out my debit card, the one linked to the joint checking account I shared with Catherine. The account Brandon now had power of attorney over as the executor of her estate. Declined. Card reported lost or stolen. The realization hit me harder than the heart attack. Brandon hadn't just locked me out of my house. He hadn't just fired me. He was systematically erasing me. He had called the banks. He had reported my cards stolen. He had frozen everything. He wanted me destitute. He wanted me dead. Sir, the pharmacist asked, her voice soft with pity. There is a line forming. Do you have another form of payment? I looked behind me. A mother with a crying baby. A guy in construction gear. They were all watching the old man in the wetsuit who couldn't pay for his heart medicine. The shame burned my face hotter than the fever. I opened my wallet. I looked at the cash I had left. I had taken out $500 for the week. I had spent $80 on the motel room. I had $420 left. That was it. That was my entire net worth until I could get to a lawyer. If I spent $140 on pills, I wouldn't have enough for food or another week at the motel. I cannot afford it, I whispered. I put the cards back in my wallet. I looked at the pharmacist. Is there anything cheaper, something for the pain, just to get me through the night? She looked at me, her eyes sad. She understood. She pointed to aisle 4. Aspirin, she said. It thins the blood. It might help. But you really should see a doctor, sir. I thanked her and walked to aisle 4. I grabbed a bottle of generic aspirin. $4.99. I paid with a $5 bill and told them to keep the penny. I walked back to the motel in the rain, chewing 2 aspirin tablets dry because I didn't have water. The bitterness coated my tongue. It was the taste of rock bottom. Back in the room, I collapsed onto the bed. I didn't take off my wet clothes. I didn't have the strength. I pulled the thin, scratchy blanket up to my chin and shivered. The aspirin dulled the edge of the pain, but the tightness remained a constant reminder of my fragility. The night was loud. Sirens wailed on the highway every 20 minutes. In the room next door, a couple was screaming at each other. Something about money. Something about betrayal. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of a country that didn't exist. Just 24 hours ago, I was sitting in my library drinking a scotch that cost more than this entire motel room. I was planning the quarterly projections. I was a man of substance. I was Harrison Mitchell. Now I was just an old body in room 104. No job, no home, no wife, no money. The darkness tried to swallow me. The grief tried to pull me under. It would have been so easy to just close my eyes and let the chest pain take me, to just drift away and be with Catherine. Brandon would win. He would get the company, the money, the legacy. He would probably laugh at my funeral. I reached into the inside pocket of my damp jacket. My fingers brushed against the leather of my wallet. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside, behind the useless credit cards, was a small square photo. It was black and white, creased at the corners. It was taken in 1985. It was me and Catherine standing in front of our very first truck. I was wearing grease-stained coveralls, my hair wild and dark. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, laughing, her hand resting possessively on the grill of the 18-wheeler. We looked tired. We looked broke. But we looked unstoppable. I traced her face with my thumb. I remembered that day. We had just secured our first major contract. We had celebrated with cheap pizza and warm beer. We didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, but we had a plan. I looked at the young man in the photo. He had fire in his eyes. He didn't care about the odds. He didn't care about the banks saying no. He just worked. I looked at that young man, and I felt a shift in the room. The air didn't feel as cold. The pain in my chest receded, replaced by a cold, hard knot of determination. I sat up on the edge of the bed. I placed the photo on the nightstand under the lamp. "You think you broke me, Brandon," I said to the empty room. "You think taking away the credit cards makes me weak. You forgot who I am. I was poor before you were born. I know how to survive on nothing. You just taught me how to fight dirty." I looked at Catherine's smile in the photo. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at me. I picked up the bottle of aspirin and took another one. I needed to stay alive. I needed to be strong. I didn't cry that night. Tears were a luxury for men who had options. I didn't have options. I had a mission. I lay back down listening to the sirens, and for the first time since Catherine died, my mind was clear. I wasn't thinking about the funeral. I wasn't thinking about the grief. I was thinking about the corporate bylaws. I was thinking about the trust fund documents I had signed 30 years ago and buried in a safe deposit box that Brandon didn't know existed. I closed my eyes. The floor was cold, the bed was hard, and my enemies were celebrating. But as I drifted into a restless sleep, my last thought was not of despair. It was a promise. Tomorrow I make a phone call. Tomorrow the old man dies and the CEO returns. The bench in Centennial Park was cold enough to seep through the thin fabric of my trousers, chilling my bones, but I didn't move. I sat there hunched over, staring at a pigeon's phone that was pecking aggressively at a discarded cigarette butt near my shoe. In my hand I held a baguette I had bought from the discount bin at the bakery 3 blocks away. It was stale, hard as a rock, and cost me 50 cents. I tore off a piece, my jaw aching with the effort of chewing it. It tasted like cardboard and dust. But my stomach was growling so loudly I was afraid the young mothers pushing strollers on the path would hear it. I watched them pass by. Normal people living normal lives. Men in suits rushing to offices complaining about coffee orders or meeting times. They had no idea that the old man on the bench, the one brushing crumbs off a stained jacket, had built half the logistics network they relied on to get those suits delivered. I was invisible. I was a ghost in the city I helped build. My phone buzzed in my pocket. My heart skipped a beat. For a second, a foolish, desperate second, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was HR calling to say there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe it was an apology. I pulled the phone out. The screen was cracked from when I dropped it in the motel parking lot, but the name was clear. Brandon. I stared at the name. My thumb hovered over the decline button. I knew I shouldn't answer. I knew nothing good could come from this. But I needed to hear him. I needed to know the depth of his depravity. I needed fuel for the fire that was just starting to spark in my chest. I slid my thumb across the screen and answered. "Hello, Hank." Brandon's voice boomed. It wasn't the private conspiratorial tone of a stepson. It had that tinny, hollow quality of a speakerphone in a large room. I could hear the background rustle of papers, the squeak of leather chairs, the low murmur of other voices. He was in a meeting. He had an audience. I stayed silent, holding the phone to my ear, listening to the wind rustle the trees in the park. "Are you there, old man?" Brandon asked, his voice dripping with performance. "I just wanted to check in on our former senior advisor. Did you find a nice cardboard box under the highway bridge yet? Or are you spooning with the rats in the subway tunnels?" A ripple of laughter went through the room on his end. It wasn't just Brandon. I recognized the high-pitched giggle of the new marketing director he had hired straight out of college. I heard the deep chuckle of the VP of sales, a man who used to shake my hand and call me a visionary every Christmas party. They were laughing. They were laughing at a 72-year-old man they believed was homeless. The laughter cut deeper than the cold. It stripped away the last layer of my professional dignity. I still didn't speak. I just breathed slow and steady. I called because I have some administrative news, Brandon continued, clearly enjoying his power trip. Since you are no longer an employee, I just signed the paperwork to terminate your executive health plan. I made it retroactive to yesterday. My hand tightened around the stale bread until it crumbled into dust. He knew about my heart. He knew I needed the nitroglycerin. He knew that without insurance, a single hospital visit would bankrupt me. I hope that ticker of yours is holding up, Hank, he sneered. Because if you have a heart attack now, you better hope the veterinarian takes coupons. Or maybe you can pay them in war stories about the good old days. The room erupted in laughter again. This time it was louder, crueler. They were baying for blood. They were watching a public execution and cheering for the executioner. Brandon waited for me to beg. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to plead for my life. He wanted to hear the sound of a broken man so he could feel like a giant. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. I looked at the pigeon which had abandoned the cigarette butt and was now watching me with beady, indifferent eyes. You will regret this, I said. I didn't shout. I didn't stutter. I said it with the flat, emotionless certainty of a judge reading a death sentence. 4 words. That was all he got. I took the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. The silence that followed was absolute. Back in the boardroom, 50 floors above the city, Brandon stared at the phone in the center of the conference table. The laughter died instantly. He had expected begging. He had expected rage. He hadn't expected a threat. And he certainly hadn't expected me to hang up on him. His face turned a deep, blotchy red. The vein in his forehead bulged. He felt small. He felt the eyes of his subordinates on him, wondering why the old man didn't sound scared. His ego, fragile as spun glass, cracked. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the water glasses jump. He thinks he is tough, Brandon roared, his voice cracking. He thinks he can threaten me. I own him. I own this company. He looked around the room, desperate to reassert his dominance, desperate to hurt me in a way that would force a reaction. His eyes landed on the quarterly asset report projected on the screen. Get me the fleet manager, he barked at the terrified marketing director. Sir, she stammered. The fleet manager, Brandon screamed. Get him on the line. I want the legacy fleet sold. All of it. A hush fell over the room. The legacy fleet wasn't just trucks. They were the original 10 Peterbilts I had bought in the 80s. They were restored, pristine, painted in the original Mitchell blue and gold. They were the heart of the company's history. They were my pride and joy. I kept them in a special garage. I polished them myself on weekends. They were the symbol of everything I had built. But sir, the VP of sales ventured, his voice trembling. Those are heritage assets. The drivers love them. They are parade vehicles. I do not care, Brandon spat. I want them gone. I want them sold for scrap if you have to. I want every trace of that old man wiped off this property by sunset. Sell them cheap. Sell them fast. Just get them out of my sight. He was breathing hard, sweating in his expensive suit. He thought he was erasing me. He thought destroying my past would destroy my future. Down in the park, I didn't need to hear the order to know it was coming. I felt a disturbance in the air, a phantom pain in my chest. I knew Brandon. I knew he was a child who broke toys when he couldn't figure out how to play with them. I stood up from the bench. My knees popped, but my legs held firm. I brushed the breadcrumbs from my trousers. I wasn't hungry anymore. The hunger had been replaced by a cold, hard purpose. I tossed the rest of the baguette to the pigeons. They swarmed over it, fighting for scraps. Enjoy it, I muttered. I turned and walked out of the park. I didn't head back to the motel. I didn't head to a bar to drink away the pain. I walked 4 blocks east past the trendy coffee shops and the boutiques until I found a gas station that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 90s. There, bolted to the brick wall near the air pump, was a payphone. It was covered in graffiti and grime, but the receiver was still attached. I didn't want to use my cell phone. Brandon controlled the account. He could track the calls. He could see the logs. If I was going to go to war, I needed to go dark. I reached into my pocket and fished out a quarter. It was one of the few coins I had left. I looked at George Washington's profile on the silver face. Liberty. I lifted the receiver. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a steady waiting sound. I slotted the quarter in. It clunked down into the mechanism. My fingers hovered over the keypad. I closed my eyes and reached back into my memory, past the grief, past the last 10 years of semi-retirement, back to the days when I was in the trenches, back to the days when you needed a shark to keep the wolves at bay. I dialed a number I hadn't called in a decade. I prayed she was still alive. I prayed she was still angry. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. I held my breath. "Yeah," a voice rasped on the other end. It sounded like gravel and cigarette smoke. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Rachel," I said. "It is Hank." There was a pause. A long, heavy silence. "Hank Mitchell," she asked. "I thought you were dead. Or retired. Which is basically the same thing." "I am not dead, Rachel," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper as a police car cruised past the gas station. "But I am about to start a war. And I need a general." I heard the distinct sound of a lighter flicking on, followed by a long inhale. "I am listening," she said. I leaned against the graffiti-stained wall, watching the rain start to fall again. Brandon had taken my health insurance. He was selling my trucks. He had humiliated me in front of the people I trained. He thought the game was over. He didn't realize I had just called in the cavalry. "Meet me," I said. "The old diner on 4th. 1 hour." I hung up the phone. The quarter didn't come back. It was the best investment I had made in years. I pulled my collar up against the rain and started walking. I had a meeting to get to. And for the first time in 3 days, I wasn't just an old man walking in the rain. I was a man with a plan. The Blue Moon Diner was a relic from a different era, tucked away in an industrial park on the edge of town, where the streetlights flickered and the potholes were deep enough to swallow a hubcap. It smelled of burnt coffee and grease that had been frying since 1970. The red vinyl booths were cracked, patched with duct tape, and the windows were covered in a film of grime that blurred the outside world into gray shapes. It was the perfect place for a meeting that never happened. I sat in the back booth facing the door. My hands were wrapped around a ceramic mug that had a chip in the rim. I watched the steam rise from the black coffee, my mind racing. I had called in the cavalry, but I wasn't sure if the cavalry still had any ammunition. Rachel Stein had been the best corporate litigator in the state 20 years ago. She was the one who had helped me navigate the hostile takeover attempt in '95. She was the one who had drafted the original incorporation papers when Catherine and I merged our assets. But she had retired 5 years ago, disappearing into a life of gardening and grandchildren. Or so I thought. The bell above the door jingled. The woman who walked in didn't look like a grandmother who spent her days pruning roses. She looked like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Rachel Stein was 65, but she walked with the same aggressive stride I remembered. She wore a sharp black trench coat over a charcoal suit that looked expensive and severe. Her silver hair was cut in a no-nonsense bob, and her eyes behind rimless glasses were scanning the room with tactical precision. She spotted me and marched over. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a hug. She slid into the booth opposite me, placed a thick leather briefcase on the table, and signaled the waitress for coffee with a single raised finger. "You look like hell, Hank," she said. Her voice was raspy, the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years arguing with judges and smoking thin cigars. I feel like hell, I admitted. Brandon fired me. He kicked me out of the penthouse. He froze my accounts. He even took my health insurance. Rachel took a sip of the water the waitress had dropped off. I know, she said, calm. I have been monitoring the corporate filings. He filed the termination paperwork with the state this morning. He listed the cause as cognitive decline due to advanced age. My hand clenched around the mug. Cognitive decline. He is telling the state I am senile. He is building a narrative. Hank, Rachel said, opening her briefcase. If you try to sue him for wrongful termination, he will drag you into court and claim you were forgetting things, making mistakes, endangering the business. He wants to invalidate your credibility before you even open your mouth. It is a classic move. Nasty, but effective. She pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed it in the center of the table. It was sealed with red wax, something old-fashioned and official. I stared at it. What is that Rachel said, tapping the envelope with a manicured fingernail, is the reason I didn't stay retired. That is Catherine's final will and testament. The real one. Not the sanitized version Brandon saw. I frowned. I don't understand. Brandon said she left everything to him. The lawyers read it. The house, the stocks, the controlling interest. He showed me the papers. Rachel allowed a small, cold smile to touch her lips. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Catherine loved that boy, Hank. But she wasn't blind. She knew Brandon. She knew he was vain, impulsive, and lazy. She knew he wanted the lifestyle of a CEO, but didn't have the stomach for the work. And she was terrified of what he would do to you once she was gone. She broke the wax seal. The sound was loud in the quiet diner. She slid a document across the table. It was titled The Mitchell Preservation Trust. Catherine came to me 3 years ago when she got her first diagnosis, Rachel explained. She wanted to set up a failsafe, a kill switch. She knew if she left the company directly to you, Brandon would fight you in court for the next 10 years. He would claim you manipulated a dying woman. He would drain the company's coffers with legal fees. So she left it to him. I asked, still confused. She left him the beneficial interest, Rachel corrected. That means he gets the profits. He gets the dividends. He gets the big salary and the fancy title. He gets to play king. But ownership and control are two very different things in corporate law. She flipped to page 42 of the document. She pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. Read that, she commanded. I squinted at the legal jargon. Class A common stock, voting rights, trusteeship. My eyes widened as I processed the words. Upon the death of Catherine Mitchell, all Class A voting shares representing 60% of the total voting power of Mitchell Logistics shall be transferred immediately into the Mitchell Preservation Trust. The sole trustee of this trust, with full and exclusive voting authority, shall be Harrison Hank Mitchell. I looked up at Rachel, my mouth dry. I own the vote, I whispered. You control the vote, Rachel said firmly. Brandon owns the shares that pay money. You control the shares that make decisions. Catherine split the equity. He gets the wallet. You get the steering wheel. But why didn't she tell me? I asked, a lump forming in my throat. Why did she keep this a secret? Because she wanted to give him a chance, Rachel said, her eyes softening for a moment. She wanted to believe he would step up. She wanted to believe that grief would make him grow up. She hoped that if he thought he was in charge, he would rise to the occasion and treat you with respect. But if he didn't, if he turned on you, then the trust activates, I finished. Rachel nodded. Exactly. But there is a catch. There is always a catch. She flipped to another page. To activate the emergency removal powers of the trustee, that means to fire the CEO and take full control, you need cause. You cannot just fire him because he was mean to you. You cannot fire him because he locked you out of the apartment. That is a civil dispute. To remove him from the CEO chair using these shares, you must prove gross negligence or intentional sabotage of corporate assets. She sat back, crossing her arms. That is the hurdle, Hank. We have the gun. We have the bullets. But we need a reason to pull the trigger that will stand up in Chancery Court. Has he done anything to the business? Not to you, but to the business. Has he made any decisions that actively damage the value of the company? I thought about the last 24 hours. I thought about the humiliation. I thought about the security guards. None of that was corporate sabotage. It was just cruelty. But then I remembered the phone call in the park. I remembered the laughter. I remembered his rage when I hung up on him. I remembered his order. He is selling the legacy fleet, I said. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. Rachel frowned. The old trucks, the ones you keep for parades. Why would he sell those? They aren't worth much on the books. He is selling them to erase me, I said, my voice gaining strength. He ordered the fleet manager to sell them for scrap if necessary. He said he wanted them gone by sunset. Rachel, those trucks are listed as heritage assets in our marketing materials. They are the face of the brand. We use them for recruitment. We use them for community outreach. Rachel's eyes lit up. She pulled a pen from her pocket and started scribbling on a napkin. Are they fully depreciated? She asked. Yes, years ago. So selling them generates almost no revenue, she muttered, thinking fast. But replacing them for marketing purposes would cost millions. And if he is selling them for scrap value, that is selling company assets below market value. That is fiscal irresponsibility. She looked up at me, a wolfish grin spreading across her face. Is he selling them to a legitimate buyer, or is he just dumping them? He is dumping them, I said. He told them to sell them cheap and fast. He was emotional. He wasn't thinking about the bottom line. He was thinking about hurting me. Rachel slammed her hand on the table. That is it, she hissed. That is the breach. Fiduciary duty requires the CEO to maximize value. Dumping assets for personal vendettas is a direct violation of that duty. It is intentional sabotage. She started packing the documents back into the envelope, her movements sharp and energized. Can you prove it? She asked. Can you get documentation of the sale? I nodded. I knew the fleet manager. I knew the codes. I knew where the trucks were kept. I can get it, I said. Rachel stood up. She threw a $20 bill on the table for the coffee she hadn't touched. Get the proof, Hank. Get photos. Get the sale orders. Get the buyer's name. If you bring me that evidence, I can walk into that boardroom on Monday morning and legally decapitate him. She looked at me, her expression fierce. Catherine didn't leave you defenseless, Hank. She left you a loaded weapon. She just prayed you would never have to use it. But that boy decided to play stupid games. He is about to win a stupid prize, I said, standing up to meet her gaze. Rachel nodded. Monday morning, 9 a.m. Don't be late. And Hank, wear a suit. You are the chairman of the board now. Look the part. She turned and walked out of the diner, her coat billowing behind her like a cape. I stood there for a moment, looking at the manila envelope in my hands. It was heavy. It was the weight of 30 years of marriage, of Catherine's love, of her silent protection. She had known. She had known he would come for me, and she had made sure I could fight back. For the first time in 3 days, the crushing weight on my chest lifted. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I wasn't just a fired employee. I was the trustee. I was the law. I picked up the envelope and walked out into the cool night air. I had work to do. I had to break into my own shipyard. I had to spy on my own company. And I had to catch a thief in the act. Brandon wanted to sell my history for scrap. He didn't realize that by doing so, he had just sold his own future. I smiled. It was a cold, hard smile. Monday couldn't come fast enough. The shipyard was located 3 miles south of the city limits, a sprawling expanse of concrete and chain-link fencing that I had purchased back in '89 when the land was nothing but swamp and potential. I knew every inch of this perimeter. I knew where the drainage pipes ran under the fence. I knew which floodlights had a 3-second delay before the motion sensors triggered. And I knew that the security camera on the northwest corner had a blind spot because the mounting bracket had rusted 5 years ago and shifted downward by 2 inches. Brandon would have known that too if he ever bothered to leave his air-conditioned office, but he didn't. He just hired new guards and assumed money bought safety. I parked my rental car a mile down the road, tucked behind an abandoned warehouse to avoid drawing attention. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and diesel fuel. It was a smell that used to mean progress to me. Tonight, it smelled like a crime scene. I pulled up the collar of my dark coat and moved through the shadows, keeping low. My knees protested with every step, a sharp reminder of my age and the lack of proper rest, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins masked the worst of the pain. I wasn't just an old man trespassing. I was the owner coming to inspect his property. I reached the northwest corner and found the gap in the fence behind the fuel tanks. It was tight. 10 years ago, I would have slipped through without touching the wire. Tonight, I had to exhale all the air from my lungs and drag myself through the mud. The metal links snagged my new jacket, tearing a small hole in the sleeve, but I didn't care. I was in. I stayed in the shadows of the fuel tanks for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the harsh sodium vapor lights that bathed the main yard in a sickly orange glow. The place should have been quiet at this hour. The night shift was usually just a skeleton crew for maintenance, but tonight the yard was buzzing with activity. I saw them. In the loading bay usually reserved for outbound freight, a line of trucks was parked. These weren't the old legacy trucks he had threatened to scrap. These were the new Kenworth T680s I had purchased just 6 months ago. Top of the line, fuel efficient, the future of the fleet. There were 10 of them lined up like soldiers facing a firing squad. I crept closer, moving from the cover of one parked trailer to the next, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear the sound of heat guns whirring and the tearing of vinyl. 2 men in coveralls were working on the lead truck. They were peeling off the Mitchell Logistics logo. I watched as the gold and blue M, a design Catherine had sketched on a napkin 30 years ago, was stripped from the door, crumpled into a ball, and tossed into a trash bin. It felt like watching someone peel the skin off a living thing. They weren't prepping these trucks for a standard sale. When you sell a fleet vehicle legitimately, you sandblast and repaint. You don't do a hasty removal job in the middle of the night, unless you are trying to hide where the truck came from before the sun comes up. I needed to get closer. I needed numbers. I waited for the workers to move to the next vehicle, then I darted across the open pavement. I crouched behind the front wheel of the first truck. I pulled out the cheap prepaid phone I had bought at the gas station. The camera quality was terrible, but it would have to do. I snapped a picture of the VIN plate on the door jamb. Then I crawled underneath the chassis. I took a picture of the engine block serial number. These trucks were worth $150,000 each. If Brandon was selling them, the money should be going back into the company accounts. But Rachel suspected he was dumping them. I needed to know who the buyer was. I saw a clipboard resting on a stack of pallets near the loading dock. The foreman had left it there while he went to argue with one of the drivers. This was my chance. I took a deep breath and moved. I was exposed for about 10 seconds. If anyone turned around, if a guard looked my way, it was over. I reached the pallets and grabbed the clipboard. My hands were shaking, making the paper rattle. I clamped my thumb down on the document to steady it. It was a bill of sale and transfer of title. I scanned the document, my eyes struggling in the dim light. The seller was listed as Mitchell Logistics. The sale price for 10 brand new Kenworths was listed as $200,000 total. $200,000. That was $20,000 a truck. That was less than the scrap value of the metal. He was practically giving them away. It was theft. It was blatant, undeniable corporate looting. But then I looked at the buyer. The company name was Blue Sky Holdings, LLC. The address listed for the buyer wasn't a corporate office or a dealership. It was 4552 Winding Creek Lane. I froze. I knew that address. I had paid the mortgage on that address for 5 years as a wedding gift. It was the address of a commercial rental space in the upscale district that Tiffany used for her failed interior design business. Blue Sky Holdings wasn't a third party. It was Tiffany. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Brandon wasn't just selling the assets to get cash. He was selling the assets to his wife for pennies on the dollar. They were transferring millions of dollars of company property into their private ownership for the price of a used sedan. Once they had the titles, they could resell the trucks at full market value and pocket $1.5 million tax-free while the company took the loss. This wasn't just bad management. This was grand larceny. This was prison time. I fumbled with the phone, snapping picture after picture of the document. I photographed the price. I photographed the buyer's address. I photographed Brandon's signature at the bottom, already signed and dated for tomorrow morning. I had it. I had the smoking gun. Rachel was going to have a field day. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the pavement just inches from my feet. "Did you hear that?" a voice shouted. It wasn't the foreman. It was one of the security guards. I dropped the clipboard back onto the pallets. It clattered loudly against the wood. "Who is there?" the guard yelled. The beam of the flashlight swung wildly, searching. I didn't have time to run back to the fence. I scrambled backward and rolled underneath the trailer of the truck nearest to me. The pavement was wet and cold, soaking through my clothes instantly. I pressed myself flat against the ground, pulling my limbs in tight. I was wedged between the landing gear and the rear tires. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard, I was terrified the sound would echo off the underside of the trailer. I could see the guard's boots. They were heavy black combat boots. He was walking toward the pallets. He stopped right in front of where I was hiding. I could see the mud on his soles. The foreman walked over. "What is it?" he asked, sounding annoyed. "I heard a noise over here," the guard said. "Like someone dropped something. Probably just a rat," the foreman grunted. "This place is infested. We are almost done. Just keep your eyes on the gate. The boss wants these trucks moved out by 4 a.m. The guard hesitated. The beam of his flashlight swept under the trailer next to mine. Then it moved to my trailer. I squeezed my eyes shut. I clutched the cheap phone to my chest like it was a holy relic. If they found me now, they wouldn't just kick me out. They would destroy the phone. They would destroy the evidence. And Brandon would win. The light passed over my legs. I lay perfectly still, willing myself to be invisible, willing my heart to stop beating so loud. "Nothing here," the guard said finally. "Just shadows." He turned and walked away. The foreman followed him. I let out a breath that shuddered in my chest. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. When I was sure they were on the other side of the yard, I crawled out. I didn't stand up. I stayed low, crab-walking back toward the fuel tanks, back toward the gap in the fence. When I finally squeezed back through the hole and stood on the other side of the perimeter, my legs gave out. I leaned against a tree, gasping for air, clutching the phone. I was covered in mud. My new clothes were ruined. My chest ached with the dull, throbbing warning. But I was smiling. I looked at the phone in my hand. It was a cheap piece of plastic, but it held the power to topple a king. "I have you, Brandon," I whispered into the night. "I have you cold." I limped back to my rental car. I needed to get this to Rachel. I needed to print these photos, and I needed to get ready. Monday was coming, and I had a meeting to attend. The lobby of the Mitchell Logistics Tower was a cavern of glass and steel that I had designed to intimidate competitors, but today it was designed to crush me. I walked through the revolving doors on Sunday afternoon, wearing my mud-stained clothes from the night before and intentionally looking like the broken old man Brandon wanted me to be. I needed one last confirmation. I needed to know there was no shred of humanity left in him, because what I was about to do to him the next morning would destroy his life, and I needed to be sure he deserved it. I approached the front desk where a young woman with bright pink nails was typing on her phone. She looked up at me with a mixture of annoyance and disgust, seeing the dirt on my jacket and the dark circles under my eyes. I told her in a voice that I forced to tremble that I needed to retrieve a bottle of heart medication I had left in my desk drawer. I told her it was an emergency. She popped her gum and told me that former employees were not allowed on the premises without an escort, and that security was busy. I leaned against the counter, making myself look smaller and frailer than I actually felt. I begged her. I told her I was in pain. I was playing the role of a lifetime. Just then, the elevator doors pinged open, and the sound of expensive leather shoes clicking on the marble floor echoed through the lobby. I turned around and saw Brandon. He wasn't alone. He was walking with two men in sharp Italian suits carrying architectural blueprints. They were pointing at the ceiling, discussing square footage and renovation costs. They were the buyers. Brandon was selling the headquarters out from under us before the board had even voted. When Brandon saw me, he stopped dead in his tracks. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He said something to the investors who laughed and stepped back to watch the show. Brandon walked over to me, looking me up and down like I was a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of his shoe. He asked me what I was doing in his building. I looked at him and said I just wanted my medicine. I said I was in pain, and I just wanted the pills, and I would leave. Brandon laughed. It was a loud, barking sound that filled the atrium. He told me that my medicine was probably in the trash by now, along with the rest of my outdated junk. He said I should check the dumpster out back if I was so desperate. Then he stopped chewing the gum he had in his mouth. He looked at his partners, then back at me. He took the gum out of his mouth. It was a wet gray wad. He dropped it. It didn't fall on the floor. It fell right on the toe of my left boot. The boot I had worn to walk the perimeter of the shipyard. The boot I had worn to build this company. "Oops," Brandon said, his voice dripping with mock apology. "I seem to have made a mess. You know how much I hate a messy lobby, Hank. It is bad for the corporate image." He pointed a manicured finger at my boot. "Clean that up," he said. The reception area went silent. The receptionist stopped typing. The security guard by the door looked away, pretending to check his radio. The two investors watched with morbid curiosity. I looked at the gum on my boot. Then I looked at Brandon. "You want me to clean your gum off my shoe?" I asked quietly. "I want you to show me you know your place," Brandon hissed, leaning in close so only I could hear. "You want your pills? You want to walk out of here without me calling the cops for trespassing? Then get on your knees and clean up the mess. Show me you are a good little employee." My heart hammered against my ribs, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a rage so pure it felt like white heat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hit him. I wanted to drive my fist into his smug jaw. I wanted to tackle him to the marble floor and beat the arrogance out of him. But if I did that, I would go to jail. If I did that, the meeting tomorrow would happen without me. If I did that, he would win. I had to lose the battle to win the war. Slowly, painfully, I bent my knees. I lowered myself to the cold, hard marble floor. I heard Brandon chuckle above me. I heard one of the investors whisper something about how sad it was to see people fall so far. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. It was old and frayed, but it was clean. I wiped the gum off my boot. I scrubbed the leather until the sticky residue was gone. I folded the handkerchief over the gum, enclosing the insult in the fabric. I stayed there on my knees for a moment longer than necessary. I was not praying. I was memorizing the pattern of the floor tiles. I was memorizing the sound of his laughter. I was memorizing the feeling of absolute powerlessness so that I would never, ever feel it again. See, Brandon said, loud and proud. The old dog can still learn new tricks. He knows who the master is now. He kicked dirt at my leg, just a little scuff of final indignity. Now get out of here, Hank, he said, and don't come back. If I see your face in this building again, I will have you arrested for harassment. And buy your own pills. You are costing me money just by breathing my air. He turned back to the investors, putting his arm around one of their shoulders, leading them toward the elevators, already talking about tearing down the lobby to make room for a digital art installation. I stood up. My knees cracked in the silence. I put the handkerchief with his gum in my pocket. I didn't ask for the pills again. I didn't need them. The adrenaline in my system was a more potent drug than anything the pharmacy could sell me. I looked at his retreating back. I looked at the way he walked, confident, careless, completely unaware that he was walking into a trap. He thought he had broken me. He thought he had seen the last of Hank Mitchell. He thought tomorrow was going to be his coronation. I lifted my head. I adjusted my collar. I looked at the receptionist who was staring at me with open pity. I didn't want her pity. "Thank you for the lesson, Brandon," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. He didn't turn around. He just waved a dismissive hand over his shoulder. I walked to the revolving doors. I pushed through into the cool evening air. The rain had cleared and the city lights were coming on. I took a deep breath. The air tasted sweet. It tasted like anticipation. I didn't go to the pharmacy. I walked straight to the bus stop. I had a meeting to prepare for. I had a suit to iron. I had a speech to rehearse. Brandon had just given me the greatest gift he could have possibly given. He had taken away my hesitation. He had taken away my guilt. I had felt bad about what I was going to do to Catherine's son. I had worried that maybe I was being too harsh. I had worried that maybe I should try to reason with him one last time. But that gum on my boot had washed away my conscience. He wanted a war. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to erase me. Well, tomorrow morning, he was going to find out that you cannot erase the man who owns the ink. I sat on the bus bench and watched the Mitchell Logistics Tower looming over the skyline. It was a beautiful building. It was going to look even better when I kicked him out of it. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf that has just found the throat. Monday was going to be a bloodbath, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The single 60-watt bulb in the motel room cast a harsh yellow light on the cheap bedspread where I laid out my armor. It wasn't made of steel or Kevlar. It was a navy blue wool suit, single-breasted, cut in a style that had gone out of fashion 10 years ago, but never lost its dignity. It was the only suit Brandon hadn't thrown into the gutter. I had been wearing it the day of the funeral, and it had been hanging in the closet of the penthouse coat room spared by accident. When I retrieved my wet bags from the curb, I found it balled up at the bottom of the garment bag, wrinkled but whole. I had spent the last hour steaming it in the bathroom, running the hot water until the mirror fogged over, smoothing out the creases with my hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean. It smelled faintly of mothballs and the expensive cologne I used to wear, a ghost of the life I was about to reclaim. I noticed a loose button on the jacket cuff. It hung by a single thread, threatening to fall off and leave me looking disheveled. I couldn't allow that. Tomorrow I had to look like a king, not a pauper. I dug through my DOP kit and found the small sewing kit I always carried when I traveled. I sat on the edge of the bed, threading the needle with steady hands. My fingers were thick, scarred from years of welding and gripping steering wheels, but they didn't shake. I pushed the needle through the fabric, pulling the thread tight. In, out, in, out. The repetitive motion was soothing. It was a simple task, a problem with a clear solution, unlike the mess my life had become. As I secured the knot and bit off the thread, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Rachel Stein. I picked it up immediately. Is everything set? I asked. The board meeting is confirmed for 9 a.m., Rachel said. Her voice was tight, urgent. The agenda was just circulated. Item number 1 is the approval of the sale of the Mitchell Logistics headquarters building to a development firm. Brandon is fast-tracking it. He claims it is a necessary liquidity event to pivot the company toward digital assets. Digital assets, I scoffed. He means cryptocurrency. He wants to gamble the company's foundation on magic internet money. Exactly, Rachel agreed. If that vote passes, Hank, the building is gone. The heritage is gone. He will have the cash to cover his tracks and pay off his debts, and it will be much harder to remove him. This is the only chance. We have to stop the vote before the ink hits the paper. I will be there, I said. Do you have the paperwork? I have the trust documents, the bylaws, and the affidavit regarding the fleet sale, she said. I also have 4 associates from my firm ready to walk in with us. We are going to overwhelm them, Hank. But you have to be ready. You have to be the one to drop the hammer. I can present the law, but you have to present the authority. I understand, I said. Get some sleep, Hank. You sound tired. I am not tired, Rachel. I am ready. I hung up the phone and looked at the suit lying on the bed. It looked like a soldier waiting for a body. I stood up and walked to the corner where I had set my shoes. They were good shoes, leather Oxfords, but they were scuffed from the rain and the mud of the shipyard. I couldn't walk into a boardroom with muddy shoes. A man's shoes told you everything about his discipline. Brandon wore $2,000 sneakers that looked like moon boots. I wore leather that I cared for. I opened a tin of polish I had bought at the drugstore. The smell of the wax filled the small room, sharp and chemical. It was a smell I associated with Sunday mornings before church, with preparation, with respect. I wrapped a rag around my finger, dipped it in the black wax, and began to work it into the leather. Small, circular motions, rubbing the wax deep into the pores of the hide. I focused entirely on the shoe in my hand. I polished away the scuff marks from the lobby floor where I had knelt. I polished away the mud from the shipyard fence. I polished away the shame of the last 4 days. With every stroke, the leather began to shine. It wasn't a superficial gloss. It was a deep, rich luster that came from friction and effort. It was the shine of resilience. I worked for 30 minutes, losing myself in the rhythm. When I was finished, the shoes looked new. They looked like they belonged on the feet of a chairman. I set them next to the bed, perfectly aligned. I walked to the sink and washed the black polish from my hands. I scrubbed until my skin was raw. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was lined, my hair was gray, but the eyes staring back at me were clear. The fog of grief was gone. The hesitation was gone. I walked back to the nightstand and picked up the framed photo of Catherine. It was the only personal item I had taken from the box. In the photo, she was laughing at something I had said, her head thrown back, her eyes crinkled with joy. She looked so full of life, so full of love for her son. She had shielded him from the hard truths of the world. She had bailed him out when his startups failed. She had covered for him when he missed meetings. She thought she was helping him. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the frame with both hands. I am sorry. Cat. I whispered to the silent room. I know you wanted him to succeed. I know you wanted him to be the man you thought he could be. You loved him too much. You loved him so much you couldn't see that you were crippling him. You gave him the keys to the kingdom before he knew how to drive. I traced the line of her jaw in the photo. And now he is burning the kingdom down. I continued, my voice cracking slightly. He is hurting the people we hired. He is destroying the name we built. I cannot let him do it. I have to stop him. And the only way to stop him is to break him. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the guilt that tried to creep in. I have to fix your mistake, my love. I have to teach him the lesson you never could. It is going to hurt. It is going to be ugly, but it is necessary. I hope you can forgive me." I kissed her image gently and placed the photo face down on the nightstand. I couldn't have her watching me tomorrow. Tomorrow was not a day for love. Tomorrow was a day for justice. I walked to the switch by the door and flipped it. The room plunged into darkness, save for the thin sliver of orange light creeping in from the parking lot under the heavy curtains. I didn't get into the bed. I didn't want to wrinkle the suit, and I didn't want to soften my resolve with sleep. I pulled the single armchair into the corner of the room facing the door. I sat down, resting my hands on my knees. I kept my back straight. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant roar of trucks on the interstate. Those were my trucks out there. My drivers. My life. I didn't close my eyes. I sat in the shadows, unmoving, breathing slowly. I was a statue of patience. I was waiting for the sun to rise. I was waiting for the clock to tick down. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to the moment I would walk back into my building and take back what was mine. I wasn't Hank the stepdad anymore. I wasn't Hank the advisor. I was Harrison Mitchell, the man who built a logistics empire from a single flatbed. Brandon thought he had buried me. He forgot that I was a seed. And come morning, I was going to grow right through the concrete floor of his boardroom. The darkness was my friend now. It was where I sharpened my knives. Monday was coming, and I was ready. The Mitchell Logistics lobby was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, clicking heels, and the low hum of morning commerce. But the moment I stepped through the revolving doors, the noise seemed to hit a wall. It was 8:55 on a Monday morning. The air conditioning was set to a crisp 68 degrees, but I felt a heat rising under my collar that had nothing to do with the temperature. I wasn't the muddy, broken old man who had knelt on this floor yesterday. I was wearing the navy suit I had stitched together in a motel room under a 60-watt bulb. I was wearing the shoes I had polished until my fingers bled. And I wasn't alone. To my right walked Rachel Stein, her heels striking the marble with the precision of a metronome. She held her leather briefcase like a weapon. Flanking us were 4 associates from her firm, men in dark suits who moved with the silent, predatory grace of sharks in deep water. We moved as a phalanx, cutting through the morning rush like the bow of an icebreaker. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. I saw the receptionist, the same girl who had popped her gum at me yesterday, freeze with her phone halfway to her ear. Her eyes widened as she took in the suit, the entourage, and the look on my face. She didn't pop her gum today. She dropped it. We marched straight toward the elevator bank. The path was clear until a shadow detached itself from the security desk. It was Miller, the new head of security Brandon had hired. He was a thick-necked man who wore his uniform like a costume. He stepped directly into my path, his hand resting on his belt, his chest puffed out. 2 other guards fell in behind him, creating a wall of black polyester and bad attitude. "Hold it right there," Miller barked, his voice booming across the silent lobby. "You know the rules, Hank. You are banned. Turn around and walk out, or I drag you out." He smirked, remembering yesterday. He remembered the old man on his knees. He expected the same man today. I didn't break stride. I didn't even look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the elevator doors behind him. Rachel stepped forward, moving seamlessly between me and the guard. She didn't shout. She didn't raise a hand. She simply reached into her briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper stamped with the seal of the Chancery Court. She held it up inches from Miller's face. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "This is an emergency injunctive order signed by Judge Holloway 20 minutes ago. It recognizes Mr. Harrison Mitchell as the majority trustee and voting shareholder of this corporation." Miller blinked, his smirk faltering. I have my orders from the CEO. Your CEO is currently the subject of a federal investigation for fiduciary fraud, Rachel snapped. And you are currently obstructing a corporate officer from attending a mandatory board meeting. Under Title 18 of the United States Code. Obstructing a shareholder with voting rights during a liquidation event is a federal felony. She took a step closer, forcing Miller to take a step back. It carries a minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary, Mr. Miller. Do you want to go to prison for a man who would fire you to save a nickel? Miller looked at the paper. He looked at the 4 grim-faced lawyers standing behind us. He looked at me. He saw the cold, hard certainty in my eyes. He saw that I wasn't bluffing. The arrogance drained out of him. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at his subordinates, who were already backing away, wanting no part of a federal case. I didn't know, he stammered. Now you do, Rachel said. Move. Miller stepped aside. He didn't just step aside, he practically jumped out of the way. The wall of security crumbled. I walked past him without a word. The path to the executive elevator was open. This elevator was different. It didn't have buttons on the outside. It had a sleek black panel that required a biometric keycard. It was the only way to reach the 40th floor directly. Brandon had deactivated my card 3 days ago. He thought that was the ultimate lock. I stood in front of the doors. I could feel the eyes of the entire lobby burning into my back. They were waiting to see me fail. They were waiting for the red light of rejection. Rachel stepped up to the panel. She didn't pull out a keycard. She pulled out a small gray device that looked like a garage door opener. He changed the user codes, she whispered to me, a small smile playing on her lips. But he didn't change the installer's master override. He doesn't even know it exists. She pressed a button on the device. The panel chirped, a long, high-pitched tone that sounded like victory. The light on the scanner turned from angry red to a welcoming green. The heavy steel doors slid open with a smooth hiss. After you, Mr. Chairman, Rachel said. I stepped inside. The air in the elevator smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. It was the smell of power. Rachel and the lawyers filed in behind me. The doors slid shut, sealing out the noise of the lobby, sealing us in a capsule of silence and purpose. I pressed the button for the 40th floor. As the elevator began to rise, I felt the gravity pressing me down, but my spirit was soaring. I closed my eyes for a second. I pictured the scene upstairs. Brandon was probably standing at the head of the long oak table right now. He was probably waving his hands, talking about synergies and crypto and the future. He was probably telling the board that the sale of the building was the only way forward. He was confident. He was safe. He thought I was eating garbage in a park. He had no idea the elevator was moving. He had no idea that the floor beneath his feet was about to open up and swallow him whole. The numbers on the display ticked upward. 10, 20, 30. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating slow and hard like a war drum. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the doors. I checked my cuffs. I looked ready. 38, 39. The elevator slowed. The bell dinged. It was a cheerful sound. The doors opened. I stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive floor. I walked toward the double glass doors of the boardroom. I could see them through the frosted glass. I could see Brandon standing at the head of the table. I didn't knock. I reached for the handles. It was time to take out the trash. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a pneumatic hiss that cut through the hushed atmosphere of the room like a blade. I stepped across the threshold, my polished shoes sinking slightly into the deep pile of the carpet. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat, a scent I recognized from 1,000 high-stakes negotiations. But today, the stench of betrayal was overpowering. At the head of the long oval table sat Brandon. He held a gold fountain pen in his hand, hovering over a thick stack of documents, that would sign away 30 years of Mitchell history to a property development firm for a quick infusion of cash. To his right sat Tiffany. She wasn't looking at the documents. She wasn't looking at the board members who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She was looking at her phone held high at a perfect 45-degree angle, the ring light clipped to the top, casting a synthetic glow on her face. "Hey guys," she was whispering to her followers, her voice carrying in the silence. "We are literally about to sign the deal of the century. Mitchell Logistics is going fully digital. Say goodbye to the old brick and mortar." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw me. Her mouth dropped open in a perfect O of surprise, but she didn't lower the phone. She just stared, broadcasting my entrance to whoever was watching her live stream. Brandon looked up a second later. He blinked as if his brain couldn't process the image in front of him. He was expecting a broken old man in wet clothes. He was expecting a ghost. Instead, he saw the man who had taught him how to tie a tie standing in a tailored navy suit, flanked by a phalanx of legal sharks. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of the projector fan and the distant wail of a siren from the street below. Then the realization hit him. "Security!" Brandon screamed, leaping from his chair so fast it tipped over backward with a crash. "Where is security? Who let this beggar in here?" He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisting into a mask of ugly panic. "Get him out," he yelled at the room at large. "Someone call the police. He is trespassing. He is dangerous." The 12 board members turned to look at me. Some of them were new faces, tech bros Brandon had brought in to rubber stamp his ideas. But half of them were old guard. Men and women I had known for decades. George from accounting. Martha from operations. They looked at me and I saw the shock in their eyes followed quickly by a flicker of hope. They had been sitting there watching their company being dismantled, too afraid of Brandon's temper to speak up. Now they sat up straighter. I didn't say a word. I didn't acknowledge Brandon's screaming. I walked calm and steady toward the other end of the table directly opposite him. Rachel Stein and her associates moved with me silently, taking up positions against the wall, their arms crossed, their expressions grim. They were the silent threat, the promise of violence wrapped in legal briefs. I reached the empty chair at the foot of the table. I pulled it out. The legs scraped against the floor, a harsh, deliberate sound that made Tiffany flinch. I sat down. I unbuttoned my jacket and rested my hands on the table, interlacing my fingers. I looked down the length of the polished wood, past the water pitchers and the notepads, straight into Brandon's eyes. "I hear you are selling the building," I said. My voice was low, gravelly, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I hear you are selling the floors where I taught your mother how to read a balance sheet. I hear you are selling the walls where I hung my first dollar." Brandon's face turned a deep, blotchy purple. He leaned over the table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. "It is not your building, Hank," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "It is my building. It is my company. Mom left it to me. I am the CEO. I have the power. I can sell whatever I want, whenever I want to, whoever I want." He looked around at the board members, desperate for validation. "Tell him," he demanded. "Tell this senile old fool that he has no standing here. He was fired for cause. He is a security risk." Nobody spoke. The investors from the development firm who were sitting near Brandon with their pens ready looked at each other nervously. They smelled trouble. They smelled a lawsuit. They started to close their folders, inching their chairs back. "You don't have the power you think you do, son," I said. "You have the title. You have the office. You have the fancy chair. But you don't have the respect. And you certainly don't have the mandate to burn this company to the ground just to pay off your gambling debts." Brandon laughed, a high hysterical sound. "Gambling debts? Is that what you think this is? This is vision, Hank. This is the future. We are pivoting to blockchain logistics. We are going to be the Uber of the metaverse. But you wouldn't understand." That would you are still living in the diesel age. You are a dinosaur, and dinosaurs go extinct. He grabbed the contract for the building sale and held his pen over the signature line, his eyes locking onto mine with a challenge. "Watch me," he whispered. "Watch me erase you." He pressed the pen to the paper. I didn't jump up. I didn't shout. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a thick manila envelope. It wasn't the trust documents. Not yet. It was the packet of photos I had printed at the 24-hour copy shop at 4 in the morning. I slid the envelope down the length of the table. It spun across the polished wood, passing the water pitchers, passing the confused board members, until it hit Brandon's hand, knocking the pen away from the paper. Ink splattered across the contract, ruining the signature line. "What is this?" Brandon sneered, looking at the envelope like it was a dead rat. "More of your sentimental garbage, pictures of you and Mom on vacation." "I don't care, Hank." "Open it," I said. Tiffany, sensing the drama, leaned in her phone camera, zooming in on the envelope. Her followers were getting a show they hadn't bargained for. Brandon ripped the envelope open. He pulled out the photos. The color drained from his face instantly. He went from purple to a sickly ash gray in the span of a heartbeat. He was looking at a photo of a brand new Kenworth T680. He was looking at a photo of the VIN number. He was looking at a photo of the Mitchell logo being peeled off the door in the dead of night. And then he saw the last photo. The photo of the clipboard. The bill of sale. His hands started to shake. The photos rattled in his grip. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine terror. Where did you get these?" he whispered. I leaned forward. "I got them last night, Brandon, while you were sleeping in my bed. While you were dreaming about how rich you were going to be. I was in the mud. I was under the trucks. I looked at the board members. Ladies and gentlemen of the board," I said, raising my voice, "what you are looking at is evidence of grand larceny and corporate embezzlement. The CEO has been secretly selling our brand new fleet assets, trucks worth $150,000 each for $20,000 apiece." Gasps rippled through the room. George from accounting dropped his glasses. "And he isn't selling them to a third party," I continued, pointing a finger at Tiffany. "He is selling them to a shell company called Blue Sky Holdings, a company registered to his wife, Tiffany Mitchell. They are looting the company. They are stealing millions of dollars of assets right under your noses to line their own pockets before they sink the ship." Tiffany shrieked. She dropped her phone. The live stream cut off as the device hit the floor, cracking the screen. "That is a lie," she screamed, standing up. "That is slander. I will sue you." "It is not slander if it is on paper, Tiffany," I said calmly. "And I have the receipts. I have the signatures. And the FBI has copies." Brandon dropped the photos. He looked at the investors who were now standing up, gathering their things, and heading for the door without a word. The deal was dead. The building sale was over. He looked back at me. He looked like a trapped animal. "You can't do this," he stammered. "I am the CEO. I make the decisions." I stood up then. I buttoned my jacket. I looked him dead in the eye. "You were the CEO, Brandon," I said. Past tense. "Because as of this moment, your tenure is over." I signaled to Rachel. She stepped forward, placing her briefcase on the table with a heavy thud. It was time for the second blow. It was time to reveal the true power in the room. Brandon thought the photos were the end. He didn't realize they were just the opening salvo. He didn't know about the 60%. He didn't know that his mother had loved him enough to leave him money, but she had trusted me enough to leave me the power. "Sit down, son," I said. "We have a vote to take, and you are not going to like the outcome." Brandon tried to laugh again, but this time the sound died in his throat, emerging as a wet, choking noise. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but the board members were studying the grain of the oak table or inspecting their fingernails. The smell of fear was radiating off him, sour and pungent, cutting through the stale coffee air. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his face a mask of crumbling bravado. "You cannot vote," he stammered, his voice rising an octave. "You are not on the board. You are not an employee. You are nobody. I own this company. My mother left me 100% of the shares." I saw the will. I saw the papers. He looked at Rachel Stein, desperate for legal validation. "Tell him," he shouted. "Tell this senile old man how the law works. Tell him he is wasting our time." Rachel didn't look at him. She opened the thick leather binder she had placed on the table. The snap of the metal rings echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She turned the pages slowly, deliberately, letting the tension ratchet up with every rustle of paper. She stopped at a page marked with a red tab. She smoothed the paper down with the palm of her hand. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, her voice calm and terrifyingly professional. "It is true that your mother left you 100% of the beneficial interest in Mitchell Logistics. That means you get the profits. You get the dividends. You get the money to buy your cars and your suits." Brandon exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding, a smirk starting to creep back onto his face. "See," he spat, looking at me. "I told you." Rachel held up a hand, silencing him instantly. However, she continued, her eyes locking onto his. "You seem to be confused about the difference between beneficial ownership and voting control. In 1985, when this company was incorporated, your mother and Hank established a dual-class stock structure. They created Class B shares, which pay dividends, and Class A shares, which hold the voting power." She turned the document around and slid it across the table toward him. "Read Clause 1985 of the Mitchell Preservation Trust." Brandon looked at the paper as if it were a poem. He didn't want to read it. He knew that whatever was written there was the end of his reign. "Read it," I commanded, my voice low and hard. "Read it out loud so everyone can hear." Brandon swallowed hard. He leaned over the document, his eyes darting across the lines. He started to read, his voice trembling. "Upon the death of the primary beneficiary, Catherine Mitchell, all Class A voting shares, representing 60% of the total voting authority, shall effectively transfer to the designated trustee." He stopped. He looked up, his eyes wide and wet. "Keep reading," I said. "The trustee," he whispered, "shall have exclusive veto power over all asset liquidations exceeding $1 million and the unilateral authority to remove any executive officer for cause. The sole trustee is Harrison Mitchell." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. The air conditioner hummed. A chair squeaked, but nobody spoke. The numbers hung in the air like a guillotine blade. 60%. Unilateral authority. Veto power. Brandon backed away from the table, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice barely a breath. "No. That is not possible. Mom would never do that. She told me I was in charge. She told me it was mine. She told you what you needed to hear to keep you from burning the house down while she was still inside it," I said. I stood up and walked around the table, closing the distance between us. I didn't rush. I walked with the heavy, measured steps of a man who knows he has already won. "Your mother loved you, Brandon. She loved you more than you deserved. But she wasn't stupid. She knew who you were. She knew you were lazy. She knew you were greedy. And she knew that the second she was gone, you would try to cash out." Brandon looked at me, tears of rage and frustration streaming down his face. "Why didn't she tell me?" he screamed. "Why did she let me think I was the boss?" "Because she was afraid of you," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It was the hardest truth I had to carry. She was afraid that if you knew you couldn't get the money immediately, you would make her last days miserable. She was afraid you might even try to speed up the process. She was afraid her own son would pull the plug to get a payout. So she protected herself. And she protected me. "You are lying," he shrieked. "You manipulated her. You forced her to sign this." "Look at the date," Rachel interjected coolly. "That document was signed 30 years ago. Hank didn't manipulate anyone. This was the plan from day one. You were never the king. You were just the prince waiting for an inheritance you were never responsible enough to handle." Tiffany, who had been silent, staring at the cracked screen of her phone, suddenly lunged. She moved faster than I expected. She threw herself across the table, her long nails clawing for the binder. "Give me that," she screamed, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly greed. "It is fake. I will tear it up. If there is no paper, there is no trust." She grabbed the page with the claws and tried to rip it out. "Don't be an idiot, Tiffany," I barked, but I didn't move to stop her. One of the associates, a large man with broad shoulders, stepped forward and caught her wrist before she could do any damage. He didn't hurt her, but his grip was iron. He held her hand away from the document, firm and unyielding. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, ma'am," he said, his voice calm. "Tampering with legal evidence is a felony." "Evidence," she spat, struggling against his grip. "It is just a piece of paper. It is a certified copy," Rachel said, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. "The original is currently sitting on the desk of a special agent at the FBI field office downtown, along with the photos of the stolen trucks and the bill of sale with your signature on it." Tiffany went still. The color drained from her face, leaving her makeup standing out like a garish mask. She looked at the associate holding her wrist, then at Rachel, then at Brandon. "The FBI," she whispered. "Grand larceny, fraud, embezzlement." Rachel listed the charges, ticking them off on her fingers. "We sent the package over an hour ago. Tearing up a copy in a boardroom won't save you. It will just add obstruction of justice to the list." The associate let go of her wrist. Tiffany slumped back into her chair, looking small and defeated. She looked at Brandon, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor, his world collapsing around him in real time. He realized then that he hadn't just lost the company. He hadn't just lost the money. He had lost his freedom. He had played a game he didn't understand against a man who had written the rules. I watched him. I watched the arrogance drain out of him, leaving behind nothing but a scared, spoiled child. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a deep, weary satisfaction. The board members were watching me now. George from accounting cleared his throat. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice respectful, deferential, "if you hold 60% of the voting shares, then you constitute a quorum by yourself. You can make any motion you see fit." I looked at George. I looked at the table where I had sat for 30 years building this company, brick by brick. I looked at Brandon shivering in his expensive suit. I motioned to dismiss the current proposal to sell the headquarters building. I said, my voice filling the room. "Seconded," George said immediately. "Motion carried," I said. "The building stays." I turned my gaze back to my stepson. "Now," I said, "let us move on to the next item on the agenda. Personnel changes." Brandon looked up at me. His eyes were pleading. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg to call me Dad for the first time in 10 years, but I didn't let him. "Sit down, Brandon," I said, pointing to the chair at the far end of the table, the one reserved for junior associates. He stumbled over to it and sat down. He looked like a prisoner waiting for the verdict. And the verdict was coming. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the room, the scent of power, the scent of justice. I placed my hands on the table. "It is time to clean house." I looked at Brandon, who was now slumped in the junior associate chair, looking like a man who had just watched his own funeral procession go by. I looked at Tiffany, who was frantically trying to wipe the mascara tears from her cheeks, realizing that her 15 minutes of internet fame had just turned into a criminal record. I looked at the board members who were waiting for the axe to fall. They wanted blood. They wanted to distance themselves from the disaster. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing with the finality of a judge's gavel. I hereby move for the immediate termination of Brandon Miller as Chief Executive Officer and Tiffany Miller as Director of Creative Branding. I said, my voice steady and cold. The grounds are breach of fiduciary duty, embezzlement of corporate assets, and conspiracy to commit fraud. This termination is for cause effective immediately with zero severance and forfeiture of all unvested stock options. I raised my right hand. It was a heavy hand scarred from years of manual labor, but it held the weight of 60% of this company. Rachel Stein raised her hand, next her expression grim and satisfied. Then George from accounting raised his hand. Martha from operations raised hers. One by one, every single member of the old guard, the people who remembered what this company stood for before Brandon turned it into his personal piggy bank, raised their hands. Even the tech bros Brandon had brought in, sensing the shift in the wind, slowly raised their hands, desperate to stay on the winning side. It was unanimous. Motion carried, I said. Brandon let out a sob. It was a pathetic sound. He tried to stand up, his legs shaking. Dad, please, he whined, reverting to the title he hadn't used since he was 12 years old and wanted a dirt bike. We can talk about this. I can fix it. I will pay the money back. I will sell the crypto. Just don't do this. Don't ruin me. I looked at him. I didn't see a son. I didn't see a CEO. I saw a thief who had stolen my grief and tried to sell it for scrap metal. It is too late for talk, Brandon, I said. You had your chance. You had 10 years of chances. I pressed a button on the intercom console in front of me. The doors to the boardroom opened again. But it wasn't Miller and his thugs who walked in. It was a new team. 4 men in dark suits, professionals Rachel had brought in from a private security firm. They didn't look like mall cops. They looked like they handled problems for people who didn't call the police. Escort these 2 off the premises, I ordered, pointing at Brandon and Tiffany. Wait, Brandon screamed, clutching his phone to his chest. You cannot just kick us out. I need my things. I need to get my files from my office. You don't have an office, I said, and you don't have any files. Everything in this building belongs to Mitchell Logistics. And since you are no longer an employee, you are not taking a single paperclip out of here. I pointed at the sleek black smartphone in his hand. Put it on the table, Brandon. What, he gasped, clutching it tighter. No, this is my phone. My crypto wallet is on here. My contacts. My life. It is a company phone, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. Paid for by the company plan. Data plan by the company. It stays. Put it on the table. Now. He hesitated. One of the security guards took a step forward. Brandon flinched. With trembling hands, he placed the phone on the polished wood. It slid a few inches, spinning slightly. The wallet too, I said. The corporate American Express. The gas cards. The building access key. All of it. He emptied his pockets. It was a pile of plastic and metal that represented his entire identity. Without those cards, without that access, he was nobody. He placed his car keys on the pile, the fob for the Maserati he had leased on the company dime. I looked at Tiffany. She was trying to make herself small in the chair, clutching her designer handbag. You too, Tiffany, I said. Me, she squeaked. I don't have anything. The bag, I said. She clutched it tighter. It is my purse. It is personal. You bought it with the corporate expense account 3 months ago, I said. I saw the receipts in the audit. It cost $4,000. It belongs to us. Empty it out and leave it. She started to cry again, loud, ugly sobs. She dumped the contents of the bag onto the table. Makeup mints, a hairbrush. She kept the phone. The phone, Tiffany, I said. She threw it on the table. It cracked against the wood. And the keys, I added. What keys? She sniffled. The keys to the penthouse, I said. The corporate housing unit you are currently occupying illegally. Hand them over." She froze. The realization hit her. She wasn't just losing her job. She was losing the roof over her head. But where will we go?" she wailed. "Our stuff is there. My clothes. You have 5 minutes to leave this building," I said, checking my watch. "Whatever you are wearing, you keep. Everything else stays until the audit is complete. We will mail you whatever personal effects are deemed not to be purchased with stolen funds, which, judging by your spending habits, won't be much." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key fob. She slammed it onto the table next to Brandon's pile of failure. "I hope you rot in hell, old man," she spat, her face twisted with hate. I looked at her hand as she pulled it back. I saw the flash of blue. "Stop," I said. The security guard, who had his hand on her elbow, paused. Tiffany tried to pull her hand inside her sleeve, hiding it. "What now?" she hissed. "I gave you everything." "Not everything," I said. I walked around the table. I stopped right in front of her. She smelled of expensive perfume and fear. I held out my hand. "The ring," I said softly. She clutched her left hand with her right, covering the finger. "No," she whispered. "You can't. It is mine." "It is Catherine's," I said. "I bought it in 1985. I worked double shifts for 2 years to pay for that stone. It was on her finger when she held my hand in the hospital. It was on her finger when she took her last breath." "You stole it from a safe. You defiled it by wearing it while you helped him loot her legacy." I took a step closer. My eyes bored into hers. "Take it off." She looked at Brandon for help, but he was staring at the table, broken. She looked at the security guards. She looked at Rachel. She saw no mercy anywhere. With shaking fingers, she pulled the ring off. It slid over her knuckle. She held it for a second, the sapphire catching the light, a beautiful deep blue that reminded me of the ocean of Catherine's eyes of better days. She dropped it into my palm. It felt warm from her skin. I closed my fingers around it, holding it tight, reclaiming the piece of my heart she had tried to steal. "Get them out of here," I said to the guards. The guards moved in. They didn't exact gentle pressure. They grabbed Brandon by the arm and hauled him up. He stumbled, almost falling. They grabbed Tiffany. "Do not touch me!" she shrieked, but they marched her toward the door. I watched them go. It was a mirror image of my own exit a week ago. They were dragged past the gaping board members, past the glass walls out into the hallway. Brandon looked back at me one last time before the doors closed. His face was a ruin of tears and snot. "Dad," he screamed. "Dad, please, we are family." The word hung in the air for a second. Family. I didn't answer. I didn't flinch. I watched the doors swing shut, cutting off his voice. The room was silent again. The only sound was the hum of the projector and the pounding of my own heart. I looked down at the pile of keys and plastic on the table. The Maserati fob. The platinum cards. The symbols of a life they hadn't earned. I put the sapphire ring into my breast pocket right over my heart. Rachel walked over and placed a hand on my arm. "It is done, Hank," she said quietly. I nodded. I felt tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went down to my soul. But I also felt light. The weight was gone. The cancer was cut out. I looked at the board members. They were watching me with a mixture of fear and respect. They were waiting for orders. "George," I said, turning to the accountant. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell," he asked, sitting up straight. "I want a full forensic audit of every transaction made in the last 6 months," I said. "Every penny. If they bought a stick of gum with company money, I want to know about it. And get the legal team to draft the eviction notices for the penthouse. I want the locks changed within the hour." "Yes, sir," George said. "Right away." "And Martha," I said to the operations director. "Yes, Hank." Get the fleet manager on the phone, I said. Tell him the sale of the legacy fleet is canceled. Tell him to get those trucks back in the paint shop. I want the logos restored. And tell him if he ever takes an order to scrap my trucks again without my signature, he can join Brandon in the unemployment line. Understood, she said, a smile touching her lips. I looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. The CEO's chair. It looked big. It looked lonely. Meeting adjourned, I said. I turned and walked toward the window. I looked out at the city skyline. The sun was high now, burning off the morning mist. I could see the traffic moving on the highway, the life of the city pulsing below. Somewhere down there, Brandon and Tiffany were standing on the sidewalk, realizing that they had nothing. No ride, no home, no money, just the clothes on their backs and the bitter taste of regret. I didn't feel happy about it. It was a tragedy, a waste of potential. But it was necessary. I touched the ring in my pocket. I kept the promise, Cat, I whispered. I saved the house. I stood there for a long time, watching the world keep turning, a solitary figure in a glass tower, the king of a broken kingdom, ready to start the long, hard work of rebuilding. The boardroom emptied slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise. The air conditioner hummed a low, steady note, scrubbing the atmosphere of the shouting and the cheap perfume. I stayed in the room for a long time, just standing there, letting my heart rate return to a rhythm that didn't threaten to crack my ribs. I walked over to the windows. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the skyline in hues of bruised purple and burnt orange. It was the end of the longest day of my life. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, crossing the hallway to the CEO's office. The door was open. The space was exactly as Brandon had left it, chaotic and disrespectful. His jacket was still thrown over the back of the chair. A half-empty cup of espresso sat on a coaster, a ring of brown stain forming on the leather. I walked over to the trash can and picked up the cardboard box he had thrown at me 3 days ago. It was dented on one side. I placed it on the desk. I sat down in the chair. It was a high-backed ergonomic model that Brandon had ordered to replace Catherine's sensible executive seat. It felt stiff, foreign. I leaned forward and placed my hands on the desk. It was solid oak, a slab of timber I had sourced from a mill in Oregon 20 years ago. I ran my palms over the grain, feeling the texture, the warmth of the wood. Brandon had rested his muddy boots here. He had treated this desk, this symbol of our work, like a footrest. I pulled a tissue from the dispenser and wiped the spot where his heels had been. I scrubbed until the invisible stain was gone. I pressed the intercom button. "Get me Mrs. Gable in Human Resources," I said. A moment later, the phone buzzed. "Mr. Mitchell," Mrs. Gable's voice was tentative, fearful. She had probably spent the last hour wondering if she was next on the chopping block. "It is Hank Alice," I said, my voice softening. "I need you to do something for me. And I need it done before the close of business today." "Yes, Hank. Anything." "I want you to pull the termination list from the last 72 hours, I said. Every single name. The drivers, the warehouse shift leaders, Susan from administration, old Mike from security. Everyone Brandon fired to save a nickel or to make a point." "I have the list right here," she said, the sound of typing clicking in the background. It is a lot of names, Hank. 32 people. Call them, I said. Call every single one of them tonight. Tell them they have their jobs back. Tell them their seniority is restored. And tell them that as an apology for the disruption, everyone is getting a 10% raise effective immediately. There was a silence on the other end. Then I heard a sniffle. 10%, she asked. 10%, I confirmed. And Alice, yes. Tell them I am back. Tell them the inmates are no longer running the asylum. I will call them right now, Hank. Thank you. I hung up the phone. It was the first time in days I felt a genuine warmth in my chest. It wasn't the heat of anger or the burn of humiliation. It was the warmth of setting things right. Brandon had tried to build a kingdom on fear. I was going to rebuild it on loyalty. I looked down at the desk. The sapphire ring was sitting there on the dark wood, catching the last rays of the sun. It looked small and lonely. I picked it up. The metal was cold now. I could still see a faint smudge on the band, a greasy fingerprint left by Tiffany's lotion. The thought of her wearing it, parading it around, while she plotted to steal my trucks, made my stomach turn. I took out my pocket square. It was silk navy blue to match my suit. I wrapped the ring in the cloth and began to polish it. I rubbed the gold band. I buffed the facets of the stone. I cleaned it with a reverence I usually reserved for religious artifacts. I was scrubbing away the greed. I was scrubbing away the entitlement. I was purifying it, returning it to what it was meant to be, a symbol of love, a promise kept. When it shined again, pristine and deep blue, I didn't put it back in a safe. I didn't put it in a box. I unbuttoned my suit jacket and slipped the ring into the inner breast pocket, the one directly over my heart. It settled there, a small weight against my ribs, a constant reminder of why I fought. My personal cell phone, the one with the cracked screen, buzzed on the desk. It vibrated harshly against the wood. I looked at the screen. It was a number I didn't recognize. A local area code. I knew who it was. Brandon didn't have his phone anymore. He didn't have his wallet. He was probably standing at a payphone, or he had borrowed a stranger's mobile, desperate, realizing that the sun was going down, and he had nowhere to go. I watched the phone vibrate. I could imagine him on the other end. He would be crying. He would be making promises he couldn't keep. He would be playing the family card again, the card he had burned the moment he threw my clothes into the rain. I reached out. My finger hovered over the green button. It would be so easy to answer, to hear him beg, to tell him off one last time, to twist the knife. But I didn't. I pressed the button to block the number. I didn't need to hear his voice. I didn't need his apologies. They were worthless currency. He wasn't my son. He wasn't my partner. He was a lesson I had finally learned. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city was spread out below me, a grid of lights waking up against the darkening sky. I could see the highway in the distance, a river of red taillights and white headlights. Somewhere down there, my trucks were moving. Men and women were driving through the night to put food on their tables, trusting that the name on the side of their rig meant something. I caught my reflection in the glass. The man staring back at me looked tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper than they had been a week ago. His shoulders were a little heavier. I had aged 10 years in 7 days. The fight had taken something from me that I would never get back. A certain innocence. A belief that family always protects its own. But as I looked closer, I saw something else. I saw a man who was standing straight. I saw a man who hadn't broken. I placed my hand against the cool glass. I kept the house cat. I whispered into the silence. I kept the trucks. I kept the people. I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. I couldn't save him, though. I tried. You know I tried. But you can't save someone who is determined to drown everyone else to stay afloat. I had to cut the rope. I imagined her standing beside me, her hand on my shoulder. I imagined her sighing that soft, sad sound she made when Brandon disappointed her. She would be sad. But she would understand. She always understood the cost of doing business. I turned away from the window. The office was dark now, lit only by the city glow. I walked to the door. I didn't look back at the desk. I didn't look back at the empty chair. I walked out into the hallway. The cleaners were already there, the night crew pushing their carts. An older woman I recognized, Maria, looked up and gasped. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, clutching her chest. You are back. I am back, Maria, I said, giving her a tired smile. She beamed. Thank God. The trash was piling up. I laughed. It was a small, dry sound, but it was real. We took the trash out today, Maria, I said. Tomorrow we start scrubbing the floors. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button. As the doors closed, shutting out the executive floor, I felt a sense of finality. The war was over. The usurpers were gone. I was alone. I was tired. I was grieving. But I was the CEO. And tomorrow I had a company to run. The screen fades to black. Here is the lesson I learned from the hardest week of my life. Never mistake silence for weakness. Brandon thought that because I was quiet, because I was old, because I was grieving, that I was defenseless. He thought he could take everything from me because I wouldn't fight back. But true power isn't about shouting or throwing boxes. True power is knowing your worth, knowing your rights, and having the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. If you build something with your own hands, never let anyone tell you it doesn't belong to you. Not even family. Especially not family. If you enjoyed this story of justice served, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us share these stories with more people. And let me know in the comments. Would you have answered that final phone call from Brandon? Or would you have blocked him just like I did? I read every single comment. Thank you for watching, and remember, respect is earned, not inherited. See you in the next video.